Okay, right. Hello, all of you out there. I've been sort of hanging around in the chat, so I've seen a few of your names in there. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about grid layout and about Subgrid. So if you don't know me, I sort of been doing things on the web for a very long time because I'm quite old. I'm also editor-in-chief of Smashing Magazine. I write books, and I'm a CSS Working Group member representing Frontiers. So I edit a couple of specs, including multi-column layout. So I'm kind of one of the people who has a sort of small part in actually trying to sort of come up with new CSS and to try and solve some of the problems that we have on the web. So we're kind of 3 years and a bit more on from grid layout shipping in browsers, but we didn't kind of stop once we got grid layout out there. Things didn't sort of shut us to a halt, because once you get a new thing, and especially a new thing that's as big as grid, it kind of exposes lots more problems, because people say, well, I can do this thing, but I now can't do some other thing that this exposes. And you know this with any product, really. If you release a new feature, people start using it and think, but it would be great if we could also do this other thing. So we kind of need to think, well, what's next? And really the big thing that we kind of knew when grid shipped that we needed was a feature that was actually removed from level 1 of the spec. And this was a concept of a subgrid. Now, when it was removed, I was a little bit worried about its removal. But I think actually kind of in retrospect, like many things that we have to wait for, I think the feature has benefited from the delay. So let's have a look at an example of why it's useful. So we have this sort of pattern. You get a design like this, a neat set of cards. They've got neat headers and footers, and everything kind of lines up really nicely as visual rows. But then that design hits the real world. You put it into your CMS, you get real content in there. And some of the cards have got more content than others. And so the cards all line up as equal height, because that's how grid works. Things will stretch by default. But the card internals, the header, the content, and the footer, are just displaying in normal flow. They've got no relationship to the grid on the parent. And this is really a fundamental thing about using the display property. Values of display don't inherit. So CSS has this concept of normal flow. That's block or inline layout. And that's pretty much the first thing you learn when you learn about CSS. Some things are block, some things are inline. And it's worth thinking that CSS will always go back to this normal flow. Values of display don't inherit. So you make a container, a grid container. The children become grid items, but inside those children, they go back to normal flow. So this is a very simple example using Flexbox. I've got a normal flow heading, a paragraph, then a box that's display flex. So the image and content are flex items. Inside the flex items, though, we go back to normal flow, and so we carry on. So because our card internals don't participate in grid layout, they can't be placed on tracks defined on the parent grid. Now that's generally useful. If layout methods inherited, you'd constantly be resetting things. You'd have to go, back to normal flow after you'd become a grid, which would generally not be that useful. But the problem comes at the time, such as these cards, where actually I'd like everything to sit on the same grid, so that those headings and the body elements and the footer, they could all sort of line up together. So we want to have the kind of the grandchildren participating in grid layout. Now we do have a way, and you might be thinking there's a way to make indirect children sit on the main grid, and that's by using display contents. But it's not going to get us quite what we want. So let's just see why. What display contents does is it removes the box from the layout that you apply it to. So you think about display none. If you say display none, it removes the box and all the children of that box as if it wasn't ever there. What display contents does is it removes the box, but it leaves the children in place. So if we look at a simple example here. So I've got a box here, and it's got a nested list inside it. So we can have a look at the markup. So I've got my div with the class of grid. I've got some direct children, some divs, and then I've got a UL and some list items inside that. So the UL is a direct child of the grid, but the list items are not. So here's the CSS. The direct grid children have got this sort of the pale background there. The direct UL children have got the pink background. So if we put display contents on the UL, what happens now is that the box of the UL gets removed, and the children kind of get promoted up to become direct children of the grid, only in terms of layout. So you can see they've still got their background color because they haven't kind of been actually turned into direct children. It's only for the case of layout. Now this could be useful if you have some sort of markup that you don't necessarily need. You want to have that there because that's how a list works or what have you, but you don't want to display its box. You could use display contents to get rid of it, but it doesn't work in our scenario because if I display contents my cards, then we just lose the cards. And so essentially the things start laying out on the grid using auto placement. We've got the header in the first cell, and the next cell is its content. Then we've got its footer, and then we've got another header. That's not what we wanted. It's not the kind of layout we were after. So display contents is a thing. It's quite a useful thing. It's probably a little bit too early to use it for tasks like removing the UL of a list, because although it's got pretty good browser support at the moment, display contents has a stonking great bug in which it was kind of implemented by browsers a bit like display none, but putting the children back. Now, display none is interesting because when you display none something, it also takes effect in things like screen readers. It's just gone. It's gone from every kind of environment. And that's not actually what we want with display contents. What we want is to remove the visual box, but so that when you've got a visual display and you're looking at it on the screen, you don't see the box, but we actually want to keep it in the accessibility tree as a list for anyone who's using it that way. When browsers implemented this, they actually removed the thing from the accessibility tree as well, which causes all sorts of problems. Browsers are fixing this. I think Firefox have already fixed it. I think Chrome I've seen activity on that issue to fix that. So at the moment, you need to be very, very careful if you remove semantic boxes using display contents. If you're using a box that isn't a sort of semantic thing, for instance, you've inserted a div because you want the div to do a fallback layout, for example, for old IE, you're probably fairly safe to remove that, but do test this stuff if you're using it. So anyway, that's display content. That's not quite what we want here. We want those card internals to line up on the parent grid. And we've sort of identified that display contents isn't the way that we're going to be able to do that. So this is where subgrid comes in. It's a subgrid value for grid template columns and grid template rows. And it basically makes it possible to declare that the children of a grid item become a subgrid. Now let's have a look at how this actually works. So we can already make a grid item into a grid. We can nest grids essentially. So you can say display grid all the way down if you want to. So here we've got a parent grid and we've got an item sat on the grid, and then we've turned that item into a grid and we've sat the sub item on this nested grid. Now you can keep on doing that all the way down. And here I'm using the Firefox Grid Inspector so we can kind of see the lines of our parent grid. So this is the outer grid we're looking at here. You can see that pink item doesn't line up with the outer grid because it's on the nested grid. And we can look at the nested grid. So this is the grid on the item, and then you can see how the sub item is placed on there. And if we select both, you can see how the lines on the nested grid just don't line up with the parent at all because it's a separate thing. You've just started again with a brand new grid layout. If you wanted those lines to kind of line up with each other, you'd have to do an awful lot of figuring out to make sure that you set things at the right size to try and get them to line up. So what Subgrid will let us do is to selectively opt grids on grid items into their parent grid layout. So in this example, we can create a subgrid for columns by setting grid template columns to subgrid. The child now uses the grid defined on the parent for the column tracks and the sizing. So we end up with that grid. We've got this grid with sort of 5 column tracks, and we place the item on there, and we're using the track numbers on the subgrid when we place the item, but it's actually using the track sizing from the parent, and you can see that there. Or you could create your subgrid just on rows. So in this case, I've got completely separate columns. The subgrid has got its own column tracks, but it's working from the rows from the parent. So we end up with 2 rows in that item. And you can create a subgrid in both dimensions. So that completely ties the dimensions of the item to the available space that it's sort of spanning. So you've made your grid on the item. It spans a certain number of tracks. We've got 5 column tracks and 2 row tracks. That's going to be the size of that subgrid. It can't get any bigger. Interestingly, that means if you have a subgrid on both columns and rows, you've got no implicit grid. So you can't just keep on pouring items in there and get new grid rows as you'd get if you used grid normally. Because what you've done is you basically locked that, to that area and said, this is how many columns and rows I've got, which is why being able to set it individually on columns and rows is quite useful, because it means you could have a subgrid on your columns, but then create implicit rows inside that component if you wanted to. So that's really the basics of using a subgrid component. There's a few subtleties that I've sort of mentioned briefly, but it's worth pointing out. The line numbers of the subgrid items start with the first line of the subgrid. So you don't have to keep track of where the thing is on your parent grid. It starts over as a new grid, just like it would if you were doing a normal nested grid. And the line numbers start from 1, so you can have a kind of component that then sits on the grid and you know where things are in it. So here's a sort of example you can actually see with the grid inspector. You can see how that works, and you can see how the lines are set up there. What you can also do, though, is if you want to kind of pass in things from the parent, so you want to be able to say position something in the subgrid according to something else that's on the parent, if you name your lines on the parent grid, those names get passed into the subgrid and you can actually use them. So you could name lines, say col start and col end on the parent grid, and you'd get those line names inside your subgrid. So you name lines in grid layout, you name them in square brackets like that. And then we can, although we've not defined those names on the item, we've got them because they've been sort of brought through from the parent. So that's a way, if you wanted to line something up with something that's in your subgrid with something that's outside the subgrid, you could use named lines to do that. You can actually add some named lines to your subgrid if you want to, if you like using named lines. Now, because you've not got, when you name lines in grid, as we saw, you name them with square brackets where the line is. Well, obviously, we haven't got any lines in our subgrid to put them between. So what you do is you name your lines after the subgrid value, just do a sort of a set of the lines within square brackets in the order that those lines come. And then you can have lines on the parent and you can have lines on the subgrid as well. And they just all, you can choose any of them to use. So here I've got my lines on my parent, I've named some lines on my subgrid, and I'm actually using both of those to position things. That's absolutely fine. Things in grid can get an awful lot of line names because these things can sort of get passed from all over the place or get created from your areas. But so you can pick any line name that works really once you've got them. So something else you'd probably expect, I guess, the subgrid inherits the gaps from the parent. So if you've used the gap or the row gap or the column gap property, they will get inherited by the subgrid. So everything just sort of lines up. I think that's probably what you'd expect. But sometimes that's not what you want. You want to get rid of the gap on the subgrid. You want to be able to use the sort of lines, but not have a gap. So we can change the gaps on the subgrid just by using the gap properties as you would normally. And then it kind of acts like a negative margin. So if I'd set my row gap here to 0, it's sort of negative margins almost into the gap that you would have, as if the line runs straight down the middle, which is what it does. And if you made the gap larger, it would almost be like adding a margin to the element. So you can do that. You can play around with the gaps once you're into a subgrid. And fairly obviously, sizing of items in the subgrid can change the size of the parent track. So if you've got, if the track is auto-sized, for example, and you add more content, then that track is going to grow to make enough space for the content as the content goes in. So that's really how we get our cards to line up. We would need to create a subgrid for grid template rows and make our card span 3 rows of the subgrid. The parent grid has a gap, which we don't want in our cards, so we set that to 0. And the card captions now will line up because each caption is essentially in the same row of the grid. So it's really quite straightforward. What we're doing is we're replacing a track definition that we would define with saying, just grab the tracks from my parent. Really, the only complexity is figuring out how many tracks that you need when you're sort of setting up the parent grid, knowing that these children are going to need to inherit them. So that card example, I think, is probably the sort of the basic example of this is why I need Subgrid. I want my card headers and footers to line up with each other. I think there's a bunch of other interesting patterns that Subgrid is going to solve for us. So here's one, and this is something you might have run into if you've used grid layout. So in grid layout, one of the sort of nice things, and something I do a lot, is you can use line -1 to mean the end line of the grid. So if you want to span an item from, the first line to the last line of your grid, you can just use, you can use grid column 1/-1, and that would get right across the grid. The problem is it's only the end line of the explicit grid, which means that quite often people say to me, why is -1 not working on rows? So let's have a look at that first. So here's my grid, and here we've got all the line numbers there. Now, if I've got 5 explicit rows here and the columns as well, which means that I have my full height item can go from grid row 1 to -1, because I've created with I've got repeat 5 and then min max 100 pixel auto. So I've got 5 rows, which are a minimum of 100 pixel and a maximum of auto. They're explicit rows. So -1 will target the end line, so line 6 essentially. But line 1 is only the end line of the explicit grid. This is really important. If you have the fairly standard pattern of defining columns, but then just letting grid create as many rows as you need for the items, and you target -1, you're going to get this. Because you don't have an explicit grid. You've not defined rows, and so the item is just going to span, -1 doesn't really make any sense in that context, so the item is just going to span 1 row, which is the default, span 1 track. So here, this is that sort of layout. I've said I want my 5 columns, but then I'm going to use grid auto rows to size as many rows as I need and just fill up the items. And this is the most common of patterns. And I see people asking this question all the time. And normally what they ask, they'll normally say, why doesn't -1 work on rows? And it's because they've created the columns, so it works on columns, but they haven't got explicit rows, so it doesn't work on rows. So we can't target the end line of the implicit grid. And when I started playing around with Subgrid, I was like, aha, this fixes that pattern. We can actually do this sort of thing. So what we need to do is place the items that we want to do the repeating thing, as many rows as we need. We place those into a container which uses a subgrid for the columns. So we end up with something that looks like this. So the reason we want to use subgrid is because we want the tall full height thing to also be the same width as all of our other items. That's what we're trying to create, a sort of a 5 equal column layout, but one of them going full height. And so by having the columns set up, we can then put all of the items into using a subgrid on the columns there. So if we have a look at the code. So I've got my grid template columns, repeat 5 if I just had before. I've not got any defined rows. I've got my grid auto rows there. Then I've got my items using a subgrid for their columns, and they're still using auto rows. But essentially, this sort of the pink block there is just in one row because I've only got a subgrid on columns. The items can still create as many rows as they want, and so we get that effect of having a full height column. The resources for this have these demos, so you can have a play around and have a look at that. So I think there's a bunch of patterns. I mean, this doesn't mean we need to add a kind of extra wrapper into the markup, but to be honest, if I had this sort of layout, that would probably be a list anyway, and I'd probably have that wrapper. I might actually be removing it in order to use grid originally. So I think a lot of the time the actual structure of your markup will let you do that anyway. So certainly when you're starting to look at Subgrid, I think there's probably a bunch of other little patterns that it's going to be really helpful for that aren't the obvious ones. So really cool, going to be incredibly useful. The bad news is that Subgrid is currently only available in Firefox. Here is Can I Use? We've got it in Firefox and nowhere else. So you can use this, or, you know, say it all works really well in Firefox. So all the demos, and I've got all the demos online, please go and have a play with them. But I don't think it's completely useless for you to be starting to think about using Subgrid and to actually, you know, start to think about how you might solve things or how you might just enhance things with it, because Subgrid works really, really well as a progressive enhancement. If you are starting to build a site today, then it may well be by the time it ships that we have Subgrid in Chrome. You know, it's not that they don't want to do it. I think it's just, you know, in a queue of things that need developing. And so, you know, at some point, I'm sure that we'll get Subgrid in Chrome. And so if you're starting a site now, you're starting a project now, there's a lot of little use cases where you can just use Subgrid as a progressive enhancement, and the site is just going to get better once it ships. And if we think about, you know, our set of cards, now they're fine like this. They're not as neat as they could be, but you could just have the Subgrid there, and it would look better for people in Firefox right now. And then when Subgrid it does actually ship for Chrome, then suddenly everyone's layout looks nicer. And you could use Subgrid there without having to do anything special. You could just add it in there because the things are just laying out in normal flow otherwise. So you could do that. If you wanted to test with feature queries, you can also do that. So there you'd need to look for either grid template rows subgrid or grid template columns subgrid in your feature query, and then you can do your subgrid stuff. So that means you could do something else, and then you could add a little enhancement using subgrid for those browsers that support it. So let's say check for grid template rows subgrid, and then you'd be able to find that, yes, you've got it and you can do it. But I mean, even if you feel like, yeah, it's a bit early to be using this yet, I do think it's really important to look at these new things as they start to emerge. You know, Chrome have been tweeting recently about a bunch of things that they've started to put into the browser and saying, look, hey, enable flags and have a look at it. And I really would encourage you to do that. If you see people tweeting about stuff that is coming, please do. Because it's really important that we do and that we engage with that stuff as web developers. And you can also help to tell browsers what you want. You know, you can always give them a little prompt on a feature. This is the Chrome bug for Subgrid, and you can see that you can star that bug there. In fact, I've even got a QR code that will take you directly to that bug. You can go there. Don't leave me too type comments on browser bugs. You know, those things are the work list for web developers, for browser engineers working on those browsers. They don't need lots of people saying, yes, that's really useful. What you can do, though, is go and star the bug. I would only really comment on a bug if you've got some new information. And when it's a sort of a feature request type bug, you probably don't have new information. If it's a problem with an existing feature, you may well have some new information that's worth adding to the bug. But just go and star it, and then you're sort of letting them know that, yes, I'm interested. The people in the community are interested in having this implemented. Also, you know, write up the stuff that you want to see in browsers. You know, if you're looking at something like Subgrid and you're like, oh, this would solve this problem, write it up. You know, do a demo that works in Firefox and say, oh, it's such a shame this doesn't work in Chrome. It adds more noise of people wanting that feature. And the reason why I particularly would like you to use things as a progressive enhancement or use it on your personal site is that browsers are looking, you know, people who work at browsers are looking to see which features people are actually starting to use online. Because if people are using a feature and your browser doesn't support it, then it's like saying, well, hey, you know, everyone's starting to use this thing and we don't support it, so their websites are going to look worse in our browser. Maybe we should support it. So everyone's looking to find out, you know, what people are actually starting to use. You can go and have a look at it. This is on chromestatus.com. You can go and see, you know, what people are using. This is grid template rows and the sort of adoption going up as people start to use grid template rows. So by using a feature, you are sending a signal that people want that feature. And as I mentioned, when you hear of things behind a flag, please go and try them out. You get to beta test the web platform. You can then go and you can raise issues with it. You can say, hey, this almost solves my problem, but if it could do this, it would be even better. You get a chance to actually offer feedback if you use things that are behind a flag. So please do, take a little bit of time and have a look. There's quite a few of us at the CSS Working Group make demos to make it really easy for you to have a look at things. All you've got to do is enable that flag and go and have a look. And see what it does, and we'd really like that. If you want to give feedback on an actual CSS property as opposed to a browser implementation, you can come and you can tell the CSS Working Group about it. All of our issues are on GitHub, so you can search and you may well find that someone's already talking about the thing that you want. And if not, you can always raise an issue. Don't worry if you discover there's a duplicate. One of us will probably pop up and say, oh, I think this is this issue over here. That's fine. Nobody minds that at all. Sometimes you're not really sure what to search on for these things. So, please do come and raise issues if you think that CSS should be able to do a certain thing and it doesn't, or, particularly if you feel that there's something missing from a feature that's already in CSS. You think it would be great if Grid could do X. Come and show us a use case for that thing you're trying to do. Or if you're already having to do it with JavaScript, for example, show us what you're having to do. And hopefully that will be something that will be considered in when we're talking about the web platform and what we need next. Because I think it's really important. There's a lot of ways that we can participate in the platform, and we want more people to participate who are actually building websites. And it has to be said, there are so few people that do this. I think the voices of those who are willing to do so are amplified. And so if you've got use cases, if there's things you're having to do with JavaScript you think should happen with CSS, come and tell us. It's a standards is a strange world, and you might think, oh, this is all a little bit obscure, and there's people sort of talking about very, very in-depth bits of browser engines. And to be honest, I don't understand, all of that stuff because I'm not a browser engineer. But what you understand as a developer is what you need to do to make the things that you're doing for clients and your products and so on. You understand what is needed, and it's very, very important that you sort of bring that back to us. And so we're always very happy to hear from people and what you need. So thank you very much for listening. It was a little bit of a quick fly through, but all the code examples which you can play with in Firefox, you'll find on that URL as well as these slides. So thank you very much. There's a couple of questions in the Google Doc. I will answer here, but I will also answer in the Google Doc in case those people are not in here, because I don't know who's in here. So the first is subgrid singular at a child level, e.g. parent grid, child grid, or can it keep going? It can keep going as long as you keep on declaring display grid. So if you had if you had a sort of a structure where you had an overall parent grid, and then you had something nested directly inside that, and then something inside that, as long as you keep on declaring display grid on each sort of level, then you can inherit the subgrid all the way down, as far down as you need to. So yeah, you can sort of keep going, but you need to say it's got to be a grid layout in order to use the grid tracks. So you are going to have to make sure that every nested thing has got display grid on it. So if you are, I think you see a lot of sites where a lot of designs where people have massively nested sort of divs and things, and I think a lot of that is very much a throwback to having to put everything in wrappers to kind of control it. And so hopefully we'll see less of that as people get used to using things like grid, and we don't need to sort of have everything in lots and lots of nested markup, because you really shouldn't be having things nested so deep. But yes, I mean, you can keep going. That's sort of how it's, as long as the thing is a grid layout, you can keep on inheriting it down. But if you have an element that isn't a grid layout, then that's going to kind of break the inheritance train, as it were. Can subgrids be siblings? I think probably easier I made a demo of that. I might stick a thing in. Basically, your subgrid is just inheriting the track sizing of the area that it's covering. So it shouldn't matter if the things are if you've got things that are overlapping, because you're basically just inheriting the track sizing. I could probably build a quick demo of that later. So yeah, so I think it doesn't matter, because really it's exactly the same as having a nested grid. Just by saying display grid and defining your columns and rows. But what you're doing is you're just taking the sizing from the parent. So it shouldn't matter if things overlap. There's sort of some interesting things about where you've got things like grid template areas and named areas and so on, where you might have a subgrid that doesn't have all of the cover the entire area. And so I remember discussing that. So there's a few kind of things that fall out of it that are a bit interesting, but yeah. Generally, it just works the same as a nested grid. It's just the sizing has come from the parent. Yeah, I've answered the ones from the Collab doc, and I'll stick something in there as well. Do we know about the timeline for rolling out Subgrid in browsers? Nope. I think with what it is with Chrome is that they are in the middle of a project. You might have heard of Layout NG, which is they're sort of rewriting this the sort of stuff that does layout in the browser. To allow for a bunch of things that have been typically very difficult, things like getting the break properties, the fragmentation properties to work properly, and so on. So I think it's queued up behind that project. And we saw this with Firefox as well, when they sort of went through their period of rewriting a whole bunch of their engine. It sort of stopped progress on rolling out new features for a little while. And I think that's sort of where we are with Chrome. So I don't think it's that they don't want to do it. I think it's just that there's a bunch of work that they're doing at the moment. And so hopefully we'll get it soon. But you never really know sort of when you're going to get things. And as for Safari, who knows? So, you never really can be sure, because, I mean, like any product, browsers are just products. And like any product, you've got a list of priorities. You've got all sorts of things that people are yelling for. And someone has to decide what goes to the top, which is why I say, talk about the stuff you want and make sure it's out there that this is things that we need to sort of help bump it in the priority list, really. My favorite measurement unit for grid. I don't think I've got a favorite. I think it would depend what I was using. I would say don't use percentages generally. We've all got very used to using percentages because we've sort of that's the only way we could do things. Even if you want to do a grid with Flexbox, you essentially have to use percentages and calculate all that stuff yourself. We've got better ways to do that in grid. We've got the FR unit, which will deal with stuff like, if you've got gaps and so on that are a certain size, it will account for them, and it'll save you having to do the math, which I think is a good thing. This stuff's been loaded on a computer, which is good at math, so you might as well let it get on with it. So yeah, I'd probably use the FR unit a lot. I like using the intrinsic sizing keywords, so things like min content, max content, fit content, particularly, to do lots of sort of like nice little components that can respond to the content of them rather than just responding to screen size, which I think is quite interesting. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff to play around with, and particularly with sizing, it's worth, if the thing that you first tried doesn't get you what you want, it's worth trying a few other things. Particularly, say, the intrinsic sizing keywords are useful to play with. I'm not sure if he would sleep on the grid. I'm just glad he's asleep, given the way that he's behaved in other things. So yeah, but I mean, do play with those demos I put out there. I think it's more straightforward than it seems at first looks, because it is just inheriting the track sizing. So you know, you can just sort of play around with that. And I'd say I think there's quite a few little things it's going to solve for us.
Any more questions? Oh, there's another one there, I think.
Is it safe to use Grid for mobile browsers? Yep, pretty much. As I say, can I use has got, but most of these things are Chromium based, and most of them are now using Grid Layout. As I say, Subgrid's we've got a little while for that to come. Yeah, I think. And as for how you convince designers to start thinking in subgrids, I think actually the stuff that you get from most designers, normally you're having to tell them that they can't do the things they're after, and actually Subgrid is going to let you take the stuff that designer gives you, like a set of cards where everything's lined up. They're going to design like that anyway, because this is normal out there in the world, of sort of regular design, of doing sort of, if you're doing print design or so on, you know, you can line things up. That's normal. So actually, I think that a lot of this stuff is just going to make it easier for us to work with designers who perhaps are less, you know, used to working with web technologies, because they're going to come up with something and we're not going to be saying, oh, we don't know how tall that is, so we can't do that. We can't line those things up. So I think actually it's going to be a lot better. Yeah, I would very much avoid it. People talking about absolute positioning. I very, very rarely use, I suppose, in anything other than writing tests. I would use Grid for an awful lot of those kind of things, because you're not going to have absolute position stuff is quite fragile. You have to do a lot of work to stop things from overlapping each other, whereas you'll get a lot of that for free using Grid Layout. Yeah. And the reason someone's saying about the shorthand grid template, that it isn't following the same as margin, you know, top, right, bottom, left, that is because Grid is writing mode agnostic. Those things are only top, right, bottom, left if you are working in a horizontal top, bottom writing mode. Grid and Flexbox both are sort of agnostic as to the writing mode of the document. And so that kind of idea of everything being top, right, bottom, left doesn't make any sense. So what Grid does is it sets the block start and the inline start and the block end and the inline end. That's kind of how we have to think about things in Grid. Vitaly has a question saying, what's the easiest way to remember the difference between justify content? So if you are in Grid Layout, then the things that begin with a line are doing alignment on the block direction. The things that begin with justify are doing alignment in the inline direction, always. It doesn't matter what your writing mode is. So if things begin with a line, so align content, align items, align self, that is block direction. So in English, top to bottom. If you are using justify, that is basically the direction in which sentences run in that writing mode. So the easy way to remember that in Grid is if you justify text in your word processor, what that does is it justifies things along the sentence, sort of spaces things out. So we use justify on the inline axis in Grid. So that's kind of how that works. And in terms of DOM order and accessibility, yeah, you need to be reasonably careful with Grid, and anything that allows you to change the order of things visually has a potential problem for accessibility, because so at the moment, if you just keyboard navigate around a site and you're tabbing around the elements on that site, that is going to follow the order that the things are in the document, not the visual order, not the way that they've been changed by Grid. So if you position things all over your grid in complete sort of randomness away from the order in the source, you could have someone kind of tabbing all over the place, jumping around everywhere. Or if someone is listening to it being read out, but they can also see the screen, which increasingly we're doing. If you think about, reading a recipe or something on some device that's got a screen and it's reading it to you as you're working, it could create a very odd experience. So I think you do need to be careful. Do test. An easy way to test that, though, is to keyboard navigate around your site. Can you still get around that layout? Does it make sense? Is there any weird jumps that you're being asked to make? Have we got any other questions? Common gotchas for Subgrid? I'm not sure there's a huge amount, really, because it's not a huge difference from what we're already doing. If you're already nesting one grid inside the other, it's basically the same. It's just that you're inheriting the sizing. I guess probably the biggest thing to look out for is to remember that you'd lose, if you've locked your grid to both columns and rows, you've lost the ability to create implicit tracks. So stuff is going to get dumped at the sort of end of the grid and stacked up, and that might be quite surprising if you weren't expecting it. So that's probably the only real thing to think about, because that's sort of different to how we're used to grid operating. But that's the thing, that's. Just going back to accessibility, the Accessibility Insights extension that Microsoft do has a tab stop checker, and it will actually draw little lines between the order of things on your page. So that's another good way to check, does it make sense, or are you sort of got lines going all over the place because people are leaping about? So that Accessibility Insights extension is really good for lots of reasons, but the tab stop thing is very handy. Subgrid isn't container queries. I think that the need for container queries, there are an awful lot of grid patterns that really get away from needing them because of things like being able to use intrinsic sizing, because of the fact that we don't have to size everything in percentages and work it all out. We can just sort of like drop a component into something and everything will just resize. It doesn't replace the need in certain circumstances for container queries, and it's something that the working groups are discussing at the moment, but it's kind of a separate thing, really. The tools I use to debug and test CSS, I have a bunch of, if I'm at home, I have a bunch of computers. There is so I use Windows, which means that I can then run I use virtual machines and things to run stuff. I've got a Mac Mini, which I use to test if I want to test in a real Safari browser, for example. And I also use Browser Stack, particularly when I'm traveling. So obviously, normally, when I'm not trapped here, I normally travel for about half the year and I don't travel with a bunch of machines. So I use Browser Stack as well for that. The main reason I've got a physical Apple device for testing is that when we were doing sort of a lot of stuff with sort of early days of Grid, it was useful to be able to actually spin stuff up properly in Safari. So, but yeah, I mean, you can get away without too many computers if you use virtual machines and so on. Okay, any more? I'm about to go off to a W3C meeting. That's the rest of my afternoon, is the W3C virtual meeting. What have we been working on recently? The CSS Working Group. Well, I'll say that the sort of container queries things have been discussed. A way to do masonry layout is something that's been recently discussed. You can always find out what we're talking about by looking at GitHub, to be honest. The things that have been raised when we discuss things at a working group meeting, the IRC minutes that are taken during that meeting, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, we have a weekly telephone call, they get posted back to the issue on GitHub. So you can always go and have a look and see exactly what we've been talking about and what was said. So, you know, if there's something you're particularly interested in, you know, just keep an eye on that GitHub repository, because the stuff that we're doing will be, you know, amongst the newer issues. Yeah, you can create fallbacks for grid layout. I've got no tips for convincing designers. It's not an issue if the page looks different in different browsers in 2020, because I've been trying to convince people that that is not an issue since about 1998, and I'm kind of bored of it now. So it's like, you know, if people don't realize that things look different on their phone to on their desktop, you know, the browsers and devices are different. They've got different capabilities. That is just the way of the web. If people won't accept that now, there's probably not a lot I can do to solve that problem. You know, as I say, I've been explaining that for like 20 years or so. So, you know, I think it's just saying this is the web, this is the medium. We can't be sure what people have. We can't be sure what their device is, what, you know, and what they're looking at and what their connection is. And that's just how it is. That's the medium. Anyway, yeah, thanks for all the questions. It's been good to chat. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. The main stage in a second once Mark has finished his talk. But thank you, Rachel, and thank you for the questions.
Okay, thanks everyone. I shall go and sit in the W3C meeting now.
Enjoy.